This is Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show with Jen Vogel. Join Jen and her guests for this live discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Also available on podcast channels. This live stream is presented to you by Vox Pop Me, the leader in video research. Here's today's live conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, everyone who wants to understand their customers better. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show. We are live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and the podcast version will be available on your favorite podcast channel. So we've all been in these situations where it's hard to data, let alone turning it into insights that we can actually use to become more customer-centric. So how do we structure, house, and work with the data that we have to get those usable insights? That's a big question into the leader in the insights industry. I'm joined today by Brenna Ivey, responsible for consumer insights and brand strategy at Wayfair today, the first of Vox Pop Me's customers to be featured on the show. Welcome, Brenna.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for having me.
So excited to have you on today. So we're going to kick things off with our question that we ask all of our guests at the start of the show. Who do you think about when you hear the word customer?
Gosh, I think about whoever we are looking to learn more. So whether that's, I've heard customer insights, I've heard consumer insights, I've heard human insights. And I think it's really just whoever that a brand or company is trying to reach, and learn more about.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction of, what you call those people. It's something we talked about on last week's show with Shep Hyken, of this idea of consumer, customer, user, and ultimately it's people that we want to learn more about. So I love that you brought that up. So let's just dive right in. So you've been in the insights industry on multiple sides of the fence for many years. What have you focused on as a customer insights professional, like your kind of goals and objectives?
So I think that point called out, which is I've, ever since I was a student, just been really interested in what makes people tick. And so whether I was on the vendor side or the client side, I've been interested in understanding people's motivations to make the choices that they make. So that can be understanding their perceptions of ads or communications and how that makes them feel about a brand, or it can be about how they interact with a product to help clients understand how to improve the product for the customer experience.
Wonderful. And so, in that kind of understanding how people tick, obviously there's a lot of different types of data that we collect. And, how do you think about qualitative versus quantitative data in that context of really understanding those people that you care the most about?
I think the most instructive graphic that I've seen is a pretty simple 2x2 where the axes are what people do versus how people feel. And what people do versus what people say, and how people act versus how they feel. And so if you're looking to understand what people do in a sense where you would have confidence in this is repeatable and you're understanding the what, that's when I would reach for quantitative methods. If I'm trying to understand why and the nuances or details, maybe this is like user research and I'm watching somebody interact with a website, that's when I would go for a qualitative method. So quant gives confidence and qual gives understanding.
I love that definition. I don't know if I've heard it described that way of, quant gives you the confidence and qual gives you the understanding. Is that what you said?
I think that's how I think about it, just because I'm so drawn to qualitative methods and I feel like I understand so much more when I see the details of something, which is certainly not to discount the explanatory power of Quant. When you see the large scale kind of landscape of what's going on, that also gives you a great picture. But I feel like that nitty gritty that you can get from qualitative, that's always helped me the most in understanding something.
Yeah, it's so important to then kind of fuse those two things together, to get that really complete picture that there's very distinct benefits or outcomes from each of the different approaches and everything in between. I love the description of the matrix. It's a very simple way to look at it and how you determine what your methodology might be based on what your needs are as an insights professional. So yeah, that's really interesting. So tell me a little bit more about your journey to getting better customer insights.
So I've been very fortunate to, as you mentioned, have experience both on the vendor side and on the client side. I started my insights career on the vendor side, and I was working mostly with online qualitative communities. So I was reading tons and tons of comments and synthesizing them into easy to read, easy to digest reports supported by consumer verbatim for my clients who were mostly in retail and CPG industries, with a little bit of healthcare sprinkled in there. And then from there, I moved on to a similar role at a firm called CNR Research that's based in Chicago, and that's one of the leaders in the field. And I was able to continue my focus on online qualitative communities while also expanding to more traditional qual methods. So one of the founding partners of CNR was actually one of the founders of the focus group methodology in the United States, which is amazing. And while I was there, I didn't learn from him, but I did learn from a colleague of his on how to moderate focus groups, how to moderate IDIs, and I really deepened my qualitative breadth of methodological expertise there. My next step was more communities, and then I started with the community research. I noticed that my clients were craving more of that quantitative and were wanting to, again, as you mentioned, marry that qual and quant. So I started strengthening my quantitative methodologies as well. And then once I was on the vendor side, I work currently at Wayfair, and there's definitely a data-driven company, and that quant confidence is something that my stakeholders really crave. So brushing up my quantitative chops over the last couple of years has been the latest step in my journey. We've done a number of different methods, including regressions, cluster analyses, and basic kind of survey crosstabs, right? And then bringing that to life with qualitative has been the name of the game.
Yeah, wonderful. That's a really exciting career, and interesting how, as the industry evolves and new methodologies emerge, and we've just seen so many different data sources emerge on the quantitative side over the last several years. There's always something new to learn and leverage, and like bringing that all together is a really special skill set that that takes a lot of years of experience to work with. So it's really, really interesting to see that the evolution of, not only your learning and your progression in your career, but how the industry has evolved alongside.
Very kind of you to say. I think that it is definitely an intellectual curiosity that I notice in many of my colleagues who are just like hungry for more information, and then being able to process that and digest and share back what you've heard, sharing back like the top 3 things you've learned after you've read 3,000 open ends. It takes practice, but and I don't think you can do it unless you are really curious about what all those 3,000 open ends say.
Yeah. We love that word curious here at Box Top Me. That's a great one. So, I mean, what's been your biggest challenge in uncovering those customer insights and really elevating from data to insight? You mentioned like, what are those top 3 learnings after you've read 3,000 open ends? Like, what's the biggest challenge in really turning that into something actionable?
So I think this is maybe where my passion for qual comes back, because I think that the best work, I'll zoom out a little bit. I think an insight is a bespoke product. So a stakeholder, a client will come to you and have a business problem that they need solved. We need more people to remember our name. We need more people to engage with this product. Whatever their problem is, it's usually not from the customer perspective. And so the insights professional's job is to think about, what does this situation look like from the customer's perspective, and then go out and ask and find out what the answer to that question is. And so the reading between the lines of what customers are saying with the understanding, a really good, crisp understanding of what the stakeholder's question is, that's how you can elevate those top 3 insights. Because if I'm reading the same data set for one stakeholder's needs, I'm going to come up with a different top 3 than I'm going to get for a different stakeholder. And client side, this happens all the time, right? Because I have both marketing stakeholders and creative stakeholders for the same ad test. They need to know different things. This ad form, the creative stakeholders need to know which parts of this really stood out to people, so that I can give them more like that for the next round of revisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you talk about, this is not something I've ever thought of as the responsibility of an insights person, but it makes a lot of sense, is like kind of translating the business need into what the customer need is and understanding that, and then translating that back. Like go ahead.
Oh, that's a perfect word for it. I think of myself, I talk about with my team as well. In fact, one of my team members said something really similar to me just the other day. I think of myself as a translator. I think that's a great word for it.
I love that. And, we talk about that a lot on, our team from a marketing perspective, and doing our own kind of customer understanding. We have very clear KPIs for the business and what goals we need to hit as a marketing organization within the business. And then we have, as we work on customer understanding and journey mapping, the KPIs is the customer meeting their needs, or are we meeting the customer's needs at this stage in the journey? And what's ultimately. And so, the insights function being that translator in between those two things is really fascinating to me. So now we talked a little bit about, all the different data sources, and you being at Wayfair, a very, data-oriented company and team. How important is it to centralize the data, and, both data and insights that you as an insights function are sourcing, and data that comes from cross-collaborative teams?
One of the values at Wayfair, or one of the values that I really appreciate about working at Wayfair, is the extraordinarily high level of data transparency. So we have access to data that you can run your own analyses. People are really empowered to run their own analyses. When we share our findings with stakeholders, we show our work, and our stakeholders can look and see the answer for themselves, just as we are empowered to go and find that answer for ourselves. So being able to centrally locate that data so that anybody can run their own analysis and do their own investigation is incredible. It's critical. When it comes to having our consumer insights data, and this is one of the things, and I know that you didn't invite me on to be a commercial for VoxPopMe, but when I originally partnered with VoxPopMe at Wayfair, it was because I was really excited about having a searchable repository for all of our qualitative interviews. When I came on, I was doing tons of IDIs. I was brought on specifically for my qualitative expertise. And so I was doing tons and tons of IDIs, and I wanted to be able to search across all of the interviews I was doing, whether I was doing them, whether someone else on my team was doing them, and be able to give my stakeholders the ability to do the same way that I can go into our data source and look up information from our marketing database. I wanted my stakeholders to be able to go in and search, what do people think of when they think about the word home, for example. And so the great search functionality that VoxPopMe offered, And since we started, my favorite product development has been the global search tool. So you can search across projects even. And we had a pretty toothpaste and Band-Aid workaround to make it work prior. But with the global search, you can search for all the projects, all 4 years worth of interviews to hear what do people think of when they think of home, or what does family, how does that connect with home? And so you can just search a word and come up with all of the hits from any interview that anyone's done, and be able to start digging into some of the texture behind trends that we're seeing in other data sources.
Well, we're always thrilled when customers are happy with the technology, so I appreciate hearing that. But I think it's really interesting that your company is so transparent with data across all different teams. Like, I know that just from conversations throughout the industry, that's a goal of a lot of companies out there, is to make that data more accessible and like make it a habit for cross-functionally other departments to be engaging with the data, understanding the different types of data that you're seeing. And maybe I have these in, working with one type of data, but there's something else I could take a look at if I'm curious about it. And so I wonder, just like, how do you encourage that, people to really dig in if it's not in their day-to-day? All the data is accessible to them. How do you encourage them to really spend some time with it and familiarize themselves? Or do you need to? Is it just part of that culture of Wayfair?
I think that everybody's quite busy. So there's a trade-off. There's that curiosity element, which is a big thing. So, for example, when I started my career reading qualitative community posts, I did not think that at any point in my life I would have to learn SQL, right? But then I learned enough SQL to be able to go in and look up some stuff. And I learned how to use SPSS because that's what I needed to do. And so that curiosity, I think, is one of the cultural elements that I think is great about Wayfair, and I think it's great about the industry and the profession. People just want to know more and they want to learn more, or else they wouldn't wind up in an insights kind of role. So nurturing that curiosity, feeding it, is a big part of it. But the trade-off is that people are busy. And so I think that's where you have to take your role really seriously about digesting it and pulling up those 2 to 3 most important nuggets, highlighting that, and then saying there's more here for your perusal. And some people will dig in if they want to, and not everybody will. But I like to say my work love language is seeing people's little faces in my Google Docs. And I will see people in a Google Doc 3-6 months later because they're digging into those customer quotes.
I love that, my work love language. I can relate to that. I love seeing people in my documents after I've shared something. That's great. And so, how do you, with all those different data sources, and like you said, you have access to everything because of that data transparency, how do you merge that quant data with qual data, with behavioral data and shopper data, all the different sources that you have available to you? How do you merge that together and really turn it into something that can be digestible?
I think this goes to the, again, going back to a qualitative skill, fundamental is asking a great question. So all of that data is totally unintelligible without the right question, because you're just overwhelmed by it. There's too much there. But if you go in with a very specific question, so I'm thinking about the coronavirus series that Vox Pop Me put out and shared with us early last year, or middle of last year, where each week there was a different question about life at home. And then maybe my stakeholders might ask, what's the deal with coronavirus, right? I can go in and look by those questions to find out how people are feeling, pair that with data that from sales, from the site experience, from like post-order NPS, right? And get that holistic picture. But it has to come from a specific question as opposed to like kind of just swimming in this ocean of data, which, as you mentioned, is totally overwhelming. So I think that coming up with good questions and pushing our stakeholders to ask really precise questions. The one I gave you as an example was not a good one, right? Because it's so vague. But if you can really hone your questions so that you're asking something very specific, you can kind of again, to use the ocean metaphor, then you're spearfishing, right? You're not just casting a wide net.
I love that. You've got some great metaphors today and some really kind of simple ways of thinking about it, which I think is great. And I love that it is a really simple approach to, looking at that ocean of data and approaching it with a very specific question that's becomes a lot less overwhelming. And I love what you said, that like the data is unintelligible without a question associated with it. When we had Dave, our CEO, on the show a few weeks ago, he talked about, data is not insights. And so I think being able to merge that together and answer a question, that's where the power really comes in. So, in terms of centralizing data, I know this is a big topic amongst, different consumer insights teams. And why is it so hard to do that? Why is it so hard to centralize data? And what can we do to, as an industry or as individuals in an insight team, to make that easier?
So I think it has to do with the different sources of data. So if you're collecting data via different survey platforms or different qualitative methodologies, or if you're getting it in different ways, then wherever you're getting it from is housed in the place that it's from, and it takes an extra step to put it into a centralized location. And of us are operating under time constraints. And so even if it does save time in the long run to centralize, if your report's due Tuesday, you're not going to hand it in Wednesday because you needed to take the extra day to put the data in the right spot. So I think that has a lot to do with it. We're always under time constraints. And I also think that it becomes really challenging once it's a devil in the details thing, right? So if you think about the structure of your data, not every survey is going to have the same number of questions or the same kind of questions. You're not ready. At Wayfair, we use Google products for business. And again, that universal search is such a lifesaver. They're constantly making improvements. I know that other teams use other products. I know Microsoft product, I'm not particularly, I'm not here to represent Google, right? But I think that just as long as whatever your system for your team is working for your team, then that's the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so hard to manage the short-term goals and the long-term goals and deadlines. Like, I totally relate to that. You're not going to miss a deadline for a day because you needed to follow an administrative step, essentially, or something like that. So I can see why it makes it so challenging to create that kind of centralized space. And so once we've got everything all together, and you've got all these different data sources, and you've got your questions and your specific business needs that you're trying to address, how do you really leverage the insights that come out to properly make decisions, and how do you get your stakeholders to actually pay attention to the insights that you're uncovering?
So I think that one great way to have credibility is to be really clear about what you are saying and what you're not saying. So having a very good understanding of what your data that you're representing and you're bringing to the table is and isn't saying is absolutely critical to getting and maintaining credibility. To give you a more concrete example of what I mean by this, I do not own the GRS tracker. So I know what the GRS report says, and I know that the GRS report says how much revenue there was, but my responsibility is understanding what consumers or what shoppers or what human beings were saying to me, and reading between the lines of what they weren't saying. And so I can talk about their inflection. And as someone who's been doing interviews for a decade in this capacity, I can say I know what they weren't saying and I know what they were holding back. And if you play back the tape, you'll hear them holding it back too. And saying, or saying, for example, in survey research, like we surveyed this population, which is an approximation of the kind of target market that we're trying to reach, but is different in these key ways. And not trying to come off like you know everything, because you're in a room with a lot of other really smart people, and people just don't take well to you coming in and saying, I know everything. What you do know is what you do know, and saying, here's one piece of the puzzle. And I know that my colleague here has another piece of the puzzle, and our other colleague has the third piece of the puzzle. Let's work with them all together and see what the right answer is. That, I think, is the best way to get credibility. I often see people who are very, very passionate about their data source, feel that it is the answer, that it's the right one. But I think maintaining perspective is the best way to build credibility, gain credibility, and also a track record helps. So usually I don't win over a stakeholder just the first time I meet them. But if I've run a couple of studies for them, if I've done a few reports, if I've explained my thought process and bring them along for the ride, as opposed to just saying, well, I know and I'm right, that never works. But letting the work speak for itself usually does.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what you were saying, the first part of your answer is like just speaks to the importance of that cross-functional collaboration. And it is really important to, as you mentioned before, you're answering very specific questions. That's the goal, is to have a very specific question that you're asking. And so saying this is what we asked and this is what we learned. This is not part of the insights, or, being clear about that is, I could see how that would be, again, just very human and very honest. And this is exactly what we're looking at and why you should pay attention to it. And I know a lot of teams are really focused on this, change management and cross-functional collaboration and bringing different teams together to come up with the answer together. And that just seems like having that knowledge from different areas and bringing that all together into one place is where you can really make an impact.
Yes, I think one of the things that I think about often is that what are people expected to be an expert on? So as an insights professional, my job is to ask people about how they feel and what they think, and they are the experts on that. There's no way that anyone at a company can be the expert on how people who are not familiar with the product or the brand feel about it, because we're just too immersed in it. I know over the last 2.5 years, I have thought more about home decor than I ever thought about in my entire life before this, like combined. And I know that when I was on the breakfast cereal account years ago, I found myself eating more sugar cereal, spending more time in the aisle, thinking about the packaging more, because it was just something that I needed to do for work. Most people are busy and are not obsessed with what we're working on the same way we're obsessed with what we're working on. So I see my role as really being as a voice of person who's not thinking about it all that hard.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something funny months ago that was I was reading about on LinkedIn. It's something about like, how likely are you to recommend, and whatever the product was a product that nobody ever actually thinks about or recommends to people. It was like, no, I'm not really recommending the, whatever it was, the brand of sugar that I buy, or I can't recall what it was, but it's so true that, nobody is thinking about our brands as much as we are. And I love what you said, that the people, the customers, the consumers, whatever they might be, are the experts on themselves and their motivations and their behaviors. It's such a beautiful mindset to come from when approaching understanding those people and what's motivating them. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective, and hopefully our listeners have gotten some really good stuff out of it. I know I certainly have. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Please rate and review us on your favorite network, and don't forget to share the show with your friends, coworkers, and bosses. In the next episode, I'll be joined